Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Mr. Midnight Lullabies. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, but before you drift off, I'd like for you to leave a comment, letting me know where in the world you are listening from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's cases. Story 1. It was just after midnight on May 1st, 2025. When a call came into Columbus Police. The address was an apartment complex on Esquire Drive, a quiet corner of the city where most nights pass without incident. But this night would be different. This night would end with 3 people dead. 2 of them young victims with their entire lives ahead of them, and one man whose final act would leave a community shattered and searching for answers. The names are now etched into public memory. Michael Hughes, 23 years old. Jan Vyers, 21. Aiden David, only 19. 3 lives, 1 night, and a decision that would bring everything to an irreversible halt. Michael Hughes was once a husband, a partner, someone who had stood beside Jan during more hopeful years. But things had changed. Their relationship fractured. She moved on, found someone new, and in the span of a few minutes, every choice, every emotion, every moment that had built up between them erupted into violence. Police say Michael forced his way into the apartment after firing a shot through the door. Inside, he found Aiden David and pulled the trigger. Jen ran, tried to escape, but he caught up to her. She was shot near the doorway. Then Michael turned the gun on himself. No warning, no time for anyone to intervene. Just silence, broken by gunfire, and a door that would never open again. This story isn't about a stranger stepping into the lives of 2 unsuspecting people. It's about someone who had already been part of that life. Someone who couldn't let go, even when it was clear things had come to an end. There are moments in stories like this where people ask, why didn't someone see it coming? The truth is often more complicated than we want to admit. Sometimes, the signs are there, scattered across months, hidden in arguments, buried in quiet fears that don't always reach the surface. And sometimes they're dismissed, downplayed, or misunderstood until it's far too late. What happened that night wasn't just a crime scene. It was the end of a story that had already been unraveling long before the first bullet was fired. A relationship strained to its breaking point. A young woman trying to move forward. A new relationship forming. And a man who couldn't or wouldn't accept that things had changed. There were lives touched by this that we may never hear from. Friends, neighbors, family members left to pick up the pieces, wondering if something could have been done differently, wondering how it all fell apart so quickly, or if it had been falling apart for far longer than anyone knew. This is a story about loss, about control, about the choices people make when they feel everything slipping away. It's about a man who made a final decision that cost not just his own life, but the lives of 2 others who didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire. This case isn't just about the crime. It's about the people, the victims, the history that led them here, and the devastating impact left behind when violence replaces understanding, when finality replaces dialogue, when grief becomes the only thing left standing. In this story, we will walk through the lives of Michael Hughes, Jan Vyers, and Aiden David. We will examine the events that led to that night, the cracks in the foundation that couldn't be mended, and the tragic choices that ended 3 futures in an instant. This is not a story told for shock. It's told to remember, to understand, to ensure the lives lost in that apartment are never reduced to just another headline. Michael Hughes was 23 years old when his life ended. To the outside world, he may have appeared like many other young men his age, navigating adulthood, searching for stability, trying to find his place in a world that moves fast and rarely waits for anyone. But beneath the surface, Michael carried weight, emotional, psychological, and eventually violent. He was once in love. That much, most who knew him would agree on. His relationship with Jan Vyers wasn't a brief encounter. It was something real, something lasting. At one point, it had all the markings of a future being built together. Shared space, shared responsibilities, the kind of intimacy that can either be comforting or destructive depending on what follows. They were married, young, yes, but not unusually so. And like many young couples, they face challenges. The kind of challenges that come with growing up alongside another person, when who you are at May 20th not match who you become at 23. Somewhere along the way, that gap widened. There are few records publicly available that show signs of early violence, but there were emotional fissures. Sources close to the case suggest there were arguments, moments of control, disagreements that lasted longer than they should, a sense over time that the relationship wasn't healing. It was fracturing. Michael had difficulty letting go. That, too, became clear. When Jeanne began to move forward with her life, Michael remained tethered to the past, not in a nostalgic sense, not with a distant sense of heartbreak, but with a fixation, a refusal to accept what had already been decided, that they were done, that she had made a choice, and it wasn't him. Some describe Michael as withdrawn during those final months, less engaged, more inward. Others say he still reached out, tried to communicate, tried to stay in her orbit, even when the conversations weren't wanted, even when the silence had already spoken for itself. Jealousy is not always loud. Sometimes it lingers quietly in thoughts that go unchecked, in wounds that aren't addressed, in ego, in pride, in fear. And as Gianna's new relationship with Aiden David began, something inside Michael shifted. Maybe it was resentment, maybe it was pain, maybe it was both, feeding off each other. Whatever it was, it grew. Michael had access to a firearm. No one knew what he intended to do with it until it was too late. But the presence of a weapon combined with a deteriorating mental state and a personal life in disarray created the worst possible conditions. In the final weeks of his life, Michael's decisions became harder to trace. He wasn't confiding in many people. If he was planning something, he kept it close. There's no evidence of a detailed manifesto or warnings sent out to friends. There were no recorded threats or police reports filed in the immediate lead-up to the shooting. But something had taken root. A conclusion had been reached in his mind. One where this act, this level of destruction, made sense to him. We may never know the full extent of Michael Hughes' thoughts before that night. We can't ask him what he hoped to accomplish. We can't rewind the timeline and insert the help he needed, whatever form that help might have taken. But we can look at the outcome, and we can ask hard questions about what leads someone to believe that murder is an option, that violence is a solution, that if he couldn't move forward, no one else should be allowed to either. Michael Hughes was not a mystery. He was a person, flawed, struggling, unwilling to face the ending of a relationship with peace. And by the time he acted, he had already decided that if his world was ending, he'd take others with him. Understanding who he was and what choices he made before that final night is not about sympathy. It's about recognition. Because if we don't recognize the patterns, we risk missing them again when someone else begins walking down the same path. Jan Byers was 21 years old. Just 21. Young, resilient, moving into a new chapter of her life. She had already been through more than many her age. A marriage that didn't last. Emotional conflict that left scars. And yet, she didn't give up on herself. To those who knew her, Jeanne was bright, compassionate, someone who believed in second chances, for others and for herself. Her relationship with Michael Hughes had once been filled with hope. There must have been moments when she truly believed it would work, that they were building something lasting. But it didn't last. By the time she ended the relationship, Jeanne was choosing something difficult. Freedom. She chose the difficult road of starting over, of standing up for herself, of creating space from someone who couldn't respect the boundary she was trying to place. When she met Aiden David, it wasn't some grand romance played out in public view. It was simple, quiet, a connection that brought her comfort. Someone who listened, someone who wasn't part of the chaos she had left behind. And in that space, she started to feel safe again, started to feel seen. Aiden was 19, a teenager by technical definition, but mature in a way that went beyond age. He had his own dreams, his own path ahead. Friends say he had a gentle way about him, thoughtful, reserved, the kind of person who didn't try to dominate a room, but whose presence mattered all the same. He had no idea what kind of storm was headed his way. He wasn't part of the past between Michael and Jeanne. He didn't provoke anything. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply existed in a life that Michael couldn't control. And for that, he became a target. On the night of May 1st, Aiden was inside that apartment, just being with Jeanne. Maybe watching something on TV. Maybe having a conversation about something mundane. Neither of them expecting what would come next. Police say Michael fired a shot through the door to get in. That alone tells us everything. He wasn't coming to talk. He wasn't coming to plead. He had already made up his mind. He entered with a gun and a goal, and Aiden David was the first to be shot. He never had a chance. No time to defend himself. No time to run. One moment, he was alive. The next, he was gone. 19 years old. Gone. Jeanne ran. She made it as far as the door. Some reports suggest she may have tried to flee down the stairs, trying to escape, maybe even hoping to get help. But Michael caught her. He fired again. She died right outside the apartment. Then he turned the gun on himself. Just like that, 3 lives were over. Aiden and Jeanne didn't die in some distant tragedy. They were murdered in a space that should have been safe, in the middle of the night, by someone who once claimed to love one of them. They were not statistics. They were not caught in a feud. They were simply trying to move forward, and were robbed of that chance. There's a cruelty in how quickly it happened, a cruelty in how final it was. Families left with no goodbyes, no warning, no answers, just grief, permanent, unrelenting grief. And the questions remain. What was said in those final seconds? Did they see it coming in that last moment? Did they think it might be someone else at the door? Or did the sound of the gunfire make it instantly clear? These are questions their loved ones live with, not because they want to, but because they have no choice. Because they wake up every day in a world where Jeanne and Aiden are no longer alive. And no reason, no explanation, no punishment will bring them back. This story cannot end with just the act itself. It has to linger in the lives they lived, in the effort Jeanne made to reclaim her independence, in the kindness Aiden gave freely, in the love they shared, however briefly, because remembering them for how they died is not enough. They deserve to be remembered for how they lived, and for the future that was stolen from both of them. The path to May 1st wasn't paved in a single moment. It was layered, over months of shifting emotions, unspoken anger, and attempts at letting go that didn't hold. Michael Hughes and Jeanne Byers had once stood at the altar together. At some point, they believed in the idea of forever. But forever is fragile, and for them it didn't last. Their marriage began to show signs of strain not long after it began. The details of their separation remained private in many ways. No court transcripts or public divorce filings were made widely available. But what we do know is this. At some point, Jeanne made a decision to separate. Whether it was slow and emotional or abrupt and painful, she made a choice to move on. By late 2024, Jeanne was no longer living with Michael. She had returned to her family and was beginning to reestablish herself, emotionally, mentally, and socially. That decision marked a major turning point. It wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was a boundary, one that would not be respected. Friends close to the couple say Michael didn't take the separation well. He reached out, he kept in contact, and though it wasn't always aggressive or threatening, there was a persistence to it. Messages that came when they weren't wanted. Questions disguised as concern. The kind of behavior that starts small, but rarely stays that way. Then came Aiden. Aiden David entered Jeanne's life sometime in early 2025. The exact date of their relationship's beginning isn't clear, but by March, it was more than casual. They spent time together regularly. Aiden was present, supportive, offering her the space to be herself again. Their relationship wasn't broadcast widely. It wasn't about proving anything to the outside world. It was about connection, about starting again with someone who didn't carry the baggage of old wounds, someone who treated her gently. Michael found out, whether through social media, mutual contacts, or direct observation. He became aware that Jeanne had moved on, and that awareness deepened the resentment. There were no public confrontations recorded, no restraining orders filed. But family members would later confirm that Michael had made repeated attempts to reconnect. to see Jeanne, to speak to her, to convince her of something she no longer wanted. In one reported instance, Michael showed up unexpectedly. He didn't threaten her outright. He didn't raise his voice. But his presence was unwanted, and it left her unsettled. This is where the warning signs begin to stack up, not in dramatic displays, but in moments of boundary pushing that went unchecked. Calls that weren't answered, texts that were ignored, silence that should have been respected. In hindsight, they were warning signs. To those closest to Jeanne, they might not have seemed alarming at the time. Just a young man struggling to accept the end of something meaningful. But hindsight is clear in ways the present never is. There's no known evidence that Michael made direct threats toward Aiden. He didn't post online rants. He didn't issue ultimatums. But something was building, internally, quietly, and without intervention. Then came April 30th, the final day. It was an ordinary Tuesday. No police calls. No disturbances. Jeanne and Aiden were at her apartment on Esquire Drive. Maybe they were cooking, watching TV, laughing at something small. For them, it was just another night together. For Michael Hughes, it was the last chapter in a story he had already decided how to end. At approximately 12:20 a.m. on May 1st, police received multiple calls reporting gunfire in the area. Witnesses said they heard a loud bang, possibly a gunshot to the front door, followed by several more. Chaos, silence, then sirens. Officers arrived to find the door forced open. Inside, they discovered the bodies of Aiden David and Michael Hughes. Outside the apartment, on the landing, lay Jeanne Viers. 3 people, 3 deaths, and no second chances. In the aftermath, family members revealed more. Jeanne had feared Michael's persistence. She had spoken to close friends about feeling watched. She had expressed discomfort, but hadn't expected violence. Not like this. Her story, like so many others, is a chilling example of what can happen when possessiveness masquerades as love, when a breakup isn't accepted, when someone refuses to release control. There may never be a full accounting of every warning sign. No journal entries to read. No recorded confessions. But the silence between the facts speaks volumes. A troubled separation. A new relationship. A man who saw the happiness of someone else and decided it was too much to bear. And so the end came, not in an explosion of rage visible to the public, but in a quiet moment turned fatal. A final decision made in secret, carried out with purpose, and remembered now only in mourning. It was just past midnight on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, a quiet residential complex. The kind of place where lights flicker behind drawn blinds, TVs murmur in the background, and most people are already asleep. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that hinted at what was about to happen. Inside one apartment, Jeanne Viers and Aiden David were spending the evening together. It could have been anything. A conversation, a movie, a quiet night in. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that it was supposed to be safe, ordinary, peaceful. At approximately 12:22 a.m., that silence was broken. According to police, the first shot came from outside the apartment, fired directly into the door. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't a warning. It was an act of violence meant to break the barrier between them. Michael Hughes had arrived, armed and ready, not to talk, not to beg, but to end things on his terms. After that first shot, he forced his way in. The door was shattered. The intrusion wasn't subtle. It was sudden and violent and absolute. Aiden David was inside, unarmed, unprepared. He didn't have a chance to defend himself. Michael shot him almost immediately. A single moment, and Aiden was gone. A life full of promise. A teenager barely on the edge of adulthood. Gone. The exact sequence of the next few seconds remains uncertain. But what is clear is that Jeanne ran. She tried to flee. She made it out of the apartment, down the hallway, maybe toward the stairs, maybe toward help, but she didn't make it far. Michael followed her. He raised the gun again, and he fired. Jeanne collapsed just outside the front door, just feet away from safety. 21 years old. In that instant, everything ended for her too. The plans, the hopes, the rebuilding, all of it taken in a blink. Then, silence again. Michael Hughes stood alone in the space he had just devastated. 2 lives ended. 2 people he once knew, one he once claimed to love, now lying lifeless. And then he turned the gun on himself. By the time officers arrived, the scene was sealed. The damage was irreversible. Police found Michael and Aiden inside the apartment. Gian was outside. All 3 were dead from gunshot wounds. The aftermath was immediate, but also strangely still. The sirens, the lights, the investigators documenting every inch of blood-spattered carpet, the silence in the air where there should have been sound, laughter, movement, life. Neighbors looked on in disbelief. A place that had once been just another unit in a quiet building was now a crime scene, a story that would ripple outward into families, schools, news headlines, and communities try to understand how something like this could happen. 3 lives were lost in under a minute. A young woman who wanted peace, a teenager who simply loved her, and a man who couldn't let go of what was no longer his. There were no drawn-out negotiations, no warning signs that night, no final phone call, no standoff, just a gun, a door, and a decision that took everything with it. The violence wasn't loud in the days leading up to it. There were no social media posts signaling intent, no emergency restraining orders filed that week. But when Michael Hughes arrived at that apartment, he came with one outcome in mind. It was targeted, deliberate, and absolute. It's the kind of act that leaves behind questions that don't go away. Why wasn't help sought earlier? Was this preventable? Could someone, anyone, have intervened? Could he have been stopped? Could she have been saved? But those questions don't change the facts. Aiden David died in a place where he should have felt safe. Jan Vyers died while trying to escape. And Michael Hughes ensured that no one would ever ask him why. And now what remains are pieces, fragments of what happened, interviews, police reports, grief, a hole in the lives of 3 families, and a reminder of how quickly, how violently a life can be taken. When the first officers arrived at the apartment complex on Esquire Drive, the damage had already been done. The door was broken. Shell casings were scattered inside and out. And there, within the small space of a quiet hallway, lay the full weight of what had happened. Michael Hughes, Jan Vyers, Aiden David, 3 individuals, 3 deaths. A triple tragedy defined by a single act of domestic violence. Police secured the scene immediately. The building was cleared. Crime scene tape stretched across walkways. Forensic teams worked through the night. The call had come in just after 12:20 a.m., and by morning, investigators had already begun piecing together the timeline. Michael had used a firearm. Legally or not, it made no difference that night. He fired a round into the door, forced entry, and opened fire inside the apartment. Aiden David died almost instantly. Jan Vyers was shot as she tried to escape. Michael then died by suicide. Columbus police quickly ruled it a double murder-suicide. No suspects were sought. No arrests were made. There was no one to prosecute. The killer had taken his own life after extinguishing 2 others. But even when a case closes on paper, its weight doesn't disappear. The questions grow louder. The silence in its wake becomes permanent. At a press conference following the incident, Sergeant Joe Alber, the Columbus Division of Police, addressed the media. His words were measured but clear. This, he said, was not an isolated case. This was part of a larger, ongoing crisis, the quiet epidemic of domestic violence. Unfortunately, domestic violence is very prevalent in our community and throughout the country, Sergeant Albert said. We want people to know there are resources out there. You are not alone. If you need help, please reach out. There are people who will listen. There are people who will stand with you. It wasn't just a police statement. It was a plea, because the signs are often there. The texts that don't stop, the sudden visits, the fear in someone's voice when they speak about an ex. It may not always look like danger, until it is, until it's too late. In Columbus, domestic violence is one of the most persistent threats facing families and individuals. According to local data, law enforcement responds to thousands of domestic-related calls every year. Not all of them end in tragedy, but too many do. Jeanne Vyers had tried to move forward. She had ended the relationship. She had created distance. But when someone refuses to let go, when someone believes they're entitled to control, it doesn't always matter what the victim chooses. That's the terrifying truth. In the days after the murders, friends and family gathered. Photos of Jeanne and Aiden began to circulate online. Young faces, now gone. Posts flooded social media. Grief, confusion, heartbreak. The kind of mourning that doesn't have an easy place to land. At candlelight vigils, community members held signs reading, "Save their names." And quietly, people asked themselves, could this have been prevented? Could someone have stepped in? Could he still be here? Resources were shared widely in the aftermath. Support organizations tried to meet the moment, hoping others in similar situations might seek help before it was too late. Local trauma recovery centers, victim advocates, and legal aid offices all fighting every day against a problem that doesn't always look like a headline until it does. The police investigation formally concluded within days. There was no mystery to solve, no trial to prepare. But for the families and for the city, the loss left more than answers. It left absence, a wound that cannot be stitched shut. Aiden David had done nothing to provoke violence. Jeanne Vyers had done everything she could to reclaim her life. And Michael Hughes, whose name is now attached forever to this violent end, left behind a legacy not of love or heartbreak, but destruction. So many domestic violence stories go unheard. This one didn't. But that doesn't mean it was any less preventable. If even one person hears this and seeks help or offers it, that may be the only thing left to salvage from a night that took everything. The tragedy that unfolded on May 1st, 2025 in Columbus, Ohio, is not an isolated incident. It is a stark reflection of a pervasive issue that affects countless individuals across communities. In Columbus, domestic violence cases have seen a concerning rise. In 2024, there were 825 reported cases, up from 733 in 2023, according to the latest police statistics. Nationally, the statistics are equally alarming. Over 1 in 3 women, 35.6%, and 1 in 4 men, 28.5%, in the United States have experienced rape, physical violence, and are stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. These numbers represent real people. Individuals whose lives have been disrupted or ended by intimate partner violence. Recognizing the warning signs of abuse is crucial. Common indicators include a partner telling you that you never do anything right, showing extreme jealousy of your friends or time spent away from them, preventing or discouraging you from spending time with others, particularly friends, family members, or peers. Understanding these signs can be the first step toward seeking help or assisting someone in need. Support systems are in place to help victims of domestic violence. The National Domestic Violence Hotline offers confidential support 24/7/365. Their services are designed to provide immediate assistance and connect individuals with local resources. In Ohio, the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, ODVN, plays a pivotal role in supporting victims and advocating for systemic change. Their efforts include raising awareness, providing training, and influencing policy to better protect individuals from domestic violence. Experts emphasize the importance of community involvement and education in combating domestic violence. By fostering environments where victims feel safe to speak out and seek help, and by holding perpetrators accountable, we can work toward reducing these tragic incidents. The story of Jeanne Vyers and Aiden David is a heartbreaking reminder of the consequences of unchecked domestic violence. It underscores the urgency of recognizing warning signs, supporting victims, and implementing effective prevention strategies. As we reflect on this tragedy, let it serve as a catalyst for awareness, education, and action against domestic violence in all its forms. There is no way to rewrite what happened on May 1st, 2025. No retelling can undo the final moments of Jeanne Vyers. No justice system can restore the life that Aiden David never got to live. And no explanation will ever make sense of what Michael Hughes did. But what we can do, what we must do, is remember not just the names, but the warning signs, not just the heartbreak, but the lessons, Every story like this one echoes far beyond the crime scene. It spreads through families, classrooms, workplaces, friend groups, quietly reminding us of how violence can enter the lives of people we know, even love, and how quickly it can escalate. Domestic violence doesn't always look the way we expect. It's not always bruises or broken bones. Sometimes it's isolation. Sometimes it's fear disguised as loyalty. Sometimes it's subtle, manipulative, and deeply psychological. And then sometimes it turns deadly. Jeanne Vyers tried to move on. She chose a new path. She deserved that chance. Aiden David chose a lover. He deserved to be safe. But love alone is not a shield. Courage alone is not always enough. If you or someone you know feels unsafe in a relationship, there is help. There are people who will believe you, people who will listen. You are not alone. You do not have to wait for it to get worse. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day. Call 1-800-799-SAFE or text START to 88788. You'll be connected with trained advocates who understand. It's free, it's confidential, and it might be the call that changes everything. In Columbus, Lutheran Social Services operates Choices, an emergency shelter and resource center for individuals fleeing abuse. They offer shelter, counseling, and safety planning. We speak their names today not only in mourning, but in hope. Hope that someone listening tonight sees a part of themselves in this story and chooses to reach out. Hope that a friend learns to ask the right question. Hope that a community learns to act just a little sooner. Because if anything can come from this tragedy, it's that someone else might live. That another story doesn't end the same way. So let this not be just a crime story. Let this be a call, a reminder, a reckoning. Because behind every statistic is a name. Behind every report is a human being trying to survive. And behind every act of violence is a moment when someone might have made a different choice. Jeanne Vyers, Aiden David, may their memories not only be honored, but remembered with purpose. Story 2. It was supposed to be the start of something beautiful. A chapter filled with hope, excitement, and the promise of a future earned through years of hard work. Tamilor Odunsi was only days away from graduating from nursing school. The culmination of years of sacrifice, studying, and dedication was within her grasp. She had already conquered the challenges of living far from home, far from the family that had raised her in the United Kingdom. Houston, Texas was where she had found her new life, one filled with the anticipation of a brighter tomorrow. She was ready to put on the cap and gown, to stand proudly on the stage, knowing that her dream was about to become a reality. She had become a part of her community, not just as a student, but as a young woman who embodied the values of kindness, compassion, and perseverance. Tamilor had become the kind of person who others could rely on, the kind of person whose future, it seemed, could only unfold in one direction, upward, but in the place where she should have felt safest, where the noise of life should have been muffled by comfort and familiarity. Tamilor's story would take a heartbreaking turn. The apartment she called home, once a sanctuary, a space filled with laughter, dreams, and plans for the future, would become the scene of a nightmare. April 26, 2025, a day that began like any other. Tamilor woke up, went through her morning routine, perhaps spoke to family back home, or made plans with friends for days to come. But that afternoon, everything changed. The day that should have been filled with excitement and celebration would be clouded by violence. In the blink of an eye, a life that had been so full of promise was taken from this world, forever. The authorities would soon arrive at the scene, drawn into the aftermath of a tragedy that no one could have predicted. What they would discover would leave them with more questions than answers. A young woman, her life cut short by a brutal act of violence. The person responsible was someone she knew, someone she had trusted, someone who had been living under the same roof. Chester Lamar Grant, Tamilor's roommate, had been in the apartment with her when it happened, a man whose actions would soon lead him down a path that would change everything. What had happened between them? What could have caused a sudden eruption of violence? A violent crime that seemed to come from nowhere. No one knew, not even Chester himself. But one thing was clear. Tamilor Odunsi would never get the chance to walk across that graduation stage. she would never become the nurse she had worked so hard to be. Her life was stolen, but so too was a life that was supposed to be her future. The future that never had the chance to unfold. And with every new piece of information that would emerge in the days to come, the mystery of Tamalor's death would grow, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a community forever changed. Tamalor O'Dunsey was only 23 years old, and in just a few days, she was set to graduate from nursing school, a milestone that marked the culmination of years of sacrifice and determination. For Tamalor, it wasn't just about earning a degree. It was a realization of a dream she had nurtured since childhood. Born and raised in the United Kingdom, she moved to the United States to pursue her education, carving out a life for herself in Houston, Texas. What started as a journey of self-discovery and academic achievement was about to take an unimaginable turn. Her friends and family often described her as kind-hearted and hardworking, someone who always put others before herself. She was known for her bright smile, her passion for helping people, and her unwavering commitment to her studies. Tamalor's life was one of ambition, of optimism, and of a future that seemed wide open before her. She was on the cusp of a new chapter, one filled with promise, one where she would finally step into the career she had worked tirelessly for. But in the blink of an eye, that future was stolen. Just days before her graduation, Tamalor's life was tragically cut short. The person responsible was someone she knew well, someone she had lived with, someone she had trusted. On the surface, Tamalor's life appeared to be one of stability and security. But the truth was far more complicated. Behind closed doors, tensions had been rising, and the relationship she shared with her roommate, Chester Lamar Grant, would soon spiral into a shocking act of violence. A dispute, one that seemed insignificant in the grand scheme of things, would lead to an irreversible tragedy, one that no one could have predicted. As the police arrived at the scene, the questions began. What had led to Tamalor's death? How could a person, one so full of life and promise, be taken so suddenly? The investigation that followed would uncover a chain of events that no one could have foreseen, revealing a side of Tamalor's life that was hidden from view and exposing the darkness that had been lurking in the shadows of her everyday existence. Tamalor O'Dunsey was born and raised in the United Kingdom, a place that shaped her early years and instilled in her a sense of determination and independence. From a young age, she had always known that she wanted to make a difference in the world. The idea of becoming a nurse wasn't something that came to her suddenly. It was a dream she had carried with her for as long as she could remember. Growing up, she was the one who would care for others, whether it was helping a sick friend or volunteering at local community centers. Her heart was always in service to others. When the opportunity arose to continue her education in the United States, Tamalor took it without hesitation. She saw it as a chance to build a future for herself and to give back in a way that would make a real impact. Houston, Texas became her new home, and it was here that her journey truly began. Moving across the ocean, far from the comforts of family and friends, was daunting, but Tamalor was determined. The transition wasn't easy. Being in a new country, adjusting to a different culture, and pursuing a rigorous nursing program was no small feat. But what stood out most about Tamalor was her unrelenting drive. She approached each challenge with a level of focus that left others in awe. She was always at the top of her class, excelling in both her theoretical coursework and clinical practice. There was an intensity to her studies that spoke to the passion she had for nursing. She wasn't just looking for a degree. She was looking to change lives, to help people, and to make her family proud. Tamalor's professors and classmates admired her not only for her academic excellence, but for the way she carried herself. She was approachable, warm, and always willing to lend a hand. Despite the pressures of nursing school, she made time to support others. She was the one to offer encouragement to a stressed-out classmate or help explain a complicated concept during study sessions. Her kindness wasn't confined to the classroom. It extended into every interaction she had. Her relationships with her friends and the people she met in Houston were a testament to the kind of person she was. They described her as someone who could light up any room with her smile, a person who made everyone feel seen and heard. It was clear that Tamalor didn't just want to be a nurse in professional sense. She wanted to be a source of comfort, a person who could make a difference in someone's life during their most vulnerable moments. As the day of her graduation approached, Tamalor's excitement was contagious. She had spent years working toward this moment, and she was just days away from finally achieving her goal. Her plans were already taking shape. She envisioned a future where she would begin her nursing career, helping patients in need, making lasting connections, and continuing to build the life she had worked so hard to create. Tamalor's future was filled with promise, filled with potential, and she was ready to embrace it fully. In those final days leading up to her graduation, Tamalor's life was full of anticipation, hope, and the overwhelming sense of accomplishment. Her journey, one of growth, perseverance, and unwavering ambition, was on the verge of reaching its most significant milestone. But all of that was about to come to an abrupt and tragic end, leaving behind the life of a young woman who had so much to give. On April 26, 2025, just days before her graduation, 23-year-old Tamalor O'Duncey's life was tragically cut short in her Houston apartment. The events leading to her death unfolded swiftly and violently. Tamalor had been living with 40-year-old Chester Lamar Grant for approximately 2 months. Their cohabitation began under the premise of shared living expenses, a common arrangement among students and young professionals. However, the relationship between the two was reportedly strained. A dispute had recently arisen over the care of their cats, which escalated tensions within the apartment. On the day of the incident, a concerned family friend initiated a welfare check after losing contact with Tamalor. Upon arrival, authorities observed blood on the rear patio of the apartment. Entering the unit, they discovered Tamalor's lifeless body in the kitchen, having suffered multiple stab wounds. Chester Grant was found in a bedroom, critically injured from self-inflicted stab wounds, including a severe neck injury. Grant was promptly transported to a local hospital, where he received treatment for his injuries. Despite initial reports suggesting a suicide attempt, he survived and was later charged with murder on May 3, 2025. He is scheduled for a court appearance on May 5, 2025. Tamalor's death has left her family, friends, and the community in shock. Known for her kindness, ambition, and dedication to her studies, she had been eagerly anticipating her graduation and the future that lay ahead. The senselessness of her death has raised profound questions about the circumstances leading to that fateful day. The discovery of Tamalor O'Duncey's body on April 26, 2025, set into motion an investigation that will unravel a complex web of events. The initial welfare check, requested by a concerned friend, was the first crucial step. Authorities arrived at the scene to find the apartment eerily quiet. The blood on the rear patio of the building hinted at the violence that had transpired inside. As officers entered the apartment, they were met with a harrowing sight of Tamalor's body in the kitchen, a chilling indication of the brutality she had faced. Chester Lamar Grant, Tamalor's roommate, was found in the bedroom with self-inflicted injuries, which initially suggested a possible suicide attempt. Officers quickly secured the scene and began their investigation, which would uncover a series of events leading to the fatal altercation between the two. It wasn't long before investigators determined that Grant had not been an innocent bystander in the tragedy, but the prime suspect. Authorities began by questioning Grant, but his critical condition hindered immediate interrogation. While being treated at the hospital, Grant remained largely uncooperative. His statements were inconsistent, and his initial claims of being attacked by an unknown assailant raised more questions than answers. The next step was to search the apartment for evidence that could shed light on what had transpired in those final moments. Investigators found signs of a violent struggle, with items scattered across the apartment, suggesting that the altercation had been intense. What stood out, however, was the absence of any indication that Tamalor had fought for her life. No defensive wounds, no signs of an attempt to escape or fight off her attacker. This was a crucial detail that led authorities to consider the possibility that she had been caught off guard, possibly during an argument. As the investigation progressed, authorities learned that tensions between Tamalor and Grant had been building for some time. While the pair had coexisted peacefully at first, things began to sour. Sources revealed that the two had recently argued over the care of their cats, a seemingly trivial issue that had escalated into deeper friction. Neighbors reported hearing loud voices coming from the apartment on the day of the crime, but no one could have anticipated that the disagreement would end in violence. Grant's history, too, began to raise alarm bells. Authorities discovered that he had a criminal record, including several past offenses that hinted at a violent temperament. Despite these red flags, the motive behind his actions on that day remained unclear. What could have pushed him to take such drastic and deadly steps against someone he had lived with? The evidence pointed toward a combination of unresolved tension, perhaps jealousy, and a sudden, uncontrolled eruption of anger. Meanwhile, the grief-stricken family of Tamilore Odunsi was left to process the unspeakable loss of a daughter, a sister, and a friend. Their heartbreak was compounded by the knowledge that Tamilore had been so close to reaching the finish line of her academic journey. She had dreamed of becoming a nurse, a dream she never had the chance to fulfill. As the investigation continued, her family's quest for answers grew more urgent, their pain deepening with each new revelation. Grant's medical recovery was slow, and as his condition improved, authorities began to piece together the timeline leading up to the fatal incident. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras showed Grant leaving the apartment building hours before Tamilore's body was discovered, further complicating his initial claims. Despite his efforts to downplay the severity of the conflict, it was clear to investigators that the events surrounding Tamilore's death were far from an accident. On May 3, 2025, after weeks of mounting evidence, Chester Lamar Grant was formally charged with murder. As his case moved forward, the investigation continued to explore the full scope of his relationship with Tamilore, examining what led to the final, fatal confrontation. But for Tamilore's family, the pain of loss remained, and the unanswered questions about her life and her death continued to haunt them. After weeks of investigation and mounting evidence, the police finally had enough to take action. On May 3, 2025, Chester Lamar Grant, the 40-year-old man responsible for Tamilore Odunsi's death, was formally charged with murder. His arrest marked a pivotal moment in a case that had shocked both the local community and Tamilore's family, who were left reeling from the senseless violence that had taken their loved one. Grant's arrest came after a thorough examination of the evidence, including forensic analysis, witness statements, and security footage. Although he had initially been found with self-inflicted injuries that suggested a suicide attempt, his version of events had grown increasingly difficult to believe. Investigators had uncovered discrepancies in his statements, and the mounting physical evidence painted a clear picture of what had transpired in the moments leading up to Tamilore's death. The most damning evidence came from the apartment itself. A forensic examination of the crime scene revealed the nature of the violent struggle that had unfolded. The position of Tamilore's body and the lack of defensive wounds indicated that she had been taken by surprise, perhaps caught in a moment of vulnerability. Grant's injuries, which were initially seen as signs of possible suicide attempt, were later interpreted as an attempt to cover up his actions, a desperate move by a man who knew his crime could not go unnoticed. As Grant's arrest was made public, it became clear that his relationship with Tamilore had been far more complicated than it had first appeared. The details surrounding their living arrangement, initially thought to be a simple roommate situation, now appeared to be tinged with tension and unresolved conflict. Sources revealed that the two had clashed over a variety of issues, and what had begun as a civil cohabitation turned into a powder keg, primed to explode. While Grant was taken into custody, the emotional toll on Tamilore's family only deepened. They had already been through the agony of losing their daughter, sister, and friend in such a violent and shocking manner, and now they had to contend with the reality of what had happened. The arrest provided some semblance of closure, but it could never replace the young woman they had lost. In the days that followed his arrest, Chester Lamar Grant remained mostly silent, his legal team working to craft a defense. However, his actions on that fateful day would continue to be scrutinized as authorities prepared for his upcoming court appearances. Grant's arrest marked the beginning of what promised to be a long and painful legal battle, as the details of Tamilore's life and her untimely death were brought to light. As the case moved forward, questions about Grant's motives and the true nature of his relationship with Tamilore began to take center stage. Was this a crime of passion? A sudden eruption of anger over a trivial dispute? Or was there something deeper at play? Something that, until now, had remained hidden beneath the surface? Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. Tamilore Odunsi's tragic death had left an indelible mark on everyone who knew her, and the fight for justice was just beginning. The arrest of Chester Lamar Grant on May 3, 2025, brought some measure of closure to the investigation, but also marked the beginning of an agonizing journey for Tamilore O'Dunsee's family and friends. The brutal, senseless murder of a young woman who had been on the verge of a promising future was a blow that no one could have prepared for. The tragedy left behind not only a deep sense of loss, but also a ripple effect that would reverberate throughout the community. For Tamilore's family, the shock of losing their daughter in such a violent and unexpected way was incomprehensible. They had watched their beloved Tamilore grow into a compassionate, driven, and ambitious woman, one who was about to achieve a lifelong dream. The thought of her future being stolen so abruptly was something they struggled to accept. The pain of not being able to see her walk across that graduation stage, of not witnessing the next chapter of her life unfold, was an unbearable reality that they were forced to live with every day. Tamilore's friends, too, were devastated. They had known her as someone who always offered a listening ear, someone who cared deeply for those around her. To think that her life had been taken by someone she had trusted, someone she had shared a home with, was a betrayal they could hardly comprehend. Her classmates and professors were equally heartbroken, remembering the young woman who was not only a dedicated nursing student, but also a bright light in their lives. In the weeks following the arrest, the legal proceedings began to unfold. Chester Grant's defense team sought to delay the trial, citing issues with his mental health and claiming that he was not fit to stand trial. But despite their attempts, the case continued to move forward. The evidence against Grant remained overwhelming. Forensic analysis, eyewitness testimony, and his own inconsistent statements about the events of that fateful day. His motives remained unclear, but the nature of the crime was undeniable. A life had been taken, and the repercussions were far-reaching. The public's reaction to Tamilore's death was one of shock and disbelief. News outlets covered the case extensively, shining a spotlight on the tragedy and the man who was responsible for it. In a world already marred by violence, this senseless killing struck a particularly deep chord. For many, it was a reminder of the fragility of life, and of the fact that sometimes the greatest dangers come from the people we least expect. In the aftermath of the crime, Tamilore's family established a foundation in her honor, dedicated to supporting young women pursuing careers in nursing and healthcare. It was their way of ensuring that Tamilore's legacy would live on, a tribute to the ambition and kindness that defined her life. Though no amount of charity or good works could replace the daughter they had lost, it gave them a sense of purpose, a way to channel their grief into something meaningful. As for Chester Grant, his legal battles continued, but for the family of Tamilore O'Dunsee, the damage had already been done. They would forever be left to grapple with the loss of a young woman who had been on the verge of greatness, someone who was taken away far too soon. The quest for justice was far from over, and with each court appearance, with each new revelation, the questions about what led to this tragedy seemed to multiply. But the one thing that remained certain was that Tamilore's death would not be forgotten. Her story, one of promise, dedication, and the pursuit of a better future, serves as a painful reminder of how quickly that future can be taken away. And as her family and loved ones continue to grieve, they hold on to the memory of the woman Tamilore was a kind soul, a devoted student, and someone whose life was filled with potential. Their fight for justice in her name is a fight to ensure that her legacy, though tragically cut short, will never be erased. The tragic death of Tamilore O'Dunsee is a stark reminder of the violence that can erupt unexpectedly, leaving behind a wake of pain and unanswered questions. At just 23 years old, Tamilore's life was full of promise and potential, a young woman on the cusp of achieving her dream of becoming a nurse. She was kind, compassionate, and dedicated to making a difference in the world. Her future was stolen from her in an instant, and with it, the dreams of a young woman who had so much to give. Chester Lamar Grant, once a roommate and a seemingly benign part of Tamilore's life, turned out to be the very person responsible for her death. His motives remain shrouded in mystery, but what is clear is that his actions robbed the world of a bright, loving individual. While the legal proceedings continue and justice may eventually be served, nothing can replace the void that Tamilore's death has left behind. For her family and friends, the pain of this loss will never fully fade. Their lives have been forever altered by the violent end of someone they loved. Yet, in the face of this tragedy, they have chosen to honor Tamilore's memory in meaningful ways. Through the foundation established in her name, they strive to ensure that Tamilore's legacy continues to touch the lives of others, especially those who share her dream of entering the nursing field. As we reflect on this case, it serves as a reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictable nature of human relationships. The people we live with, the people we trust, sometimes those are the ones who can cause the greatest harm. It is a tragedy that leaves us asking questions that may never have answers. But one thing is certain. Tamiloro Duncy will not be forgotten. Her life, her dreams, and her kindness will live on to the people who loved her, and in the hearts of those who never had the chance to know her. Tamiloro's story will continue to inspire a sense of hope, resilience, and the unwavering belief in the power of doing good in the world. Story 3. When a young woman disappears, the silence that follows is often more deafening than the cries for help. Her friends call, her family waits, and her name drifts further from the headlines. But Rosalie Rodriguez's name was never meant to fade. She was just 24 years old, a daughter, a friend, newly pregnant. Full of hope for a future, she believed she still had time to build. She had people who loved her, people who depended on her. But in the summer of 2020, all communication stopped. Her phone went dark. Her presence vanished without explanation. And those who loved her were left with only questions. For weeks, there was no trace of her, no sudden goodbye, no clear indication that she had chosen to walk away. There were no public alerts, no dramatic police chases, no press conferences filled with updates, just a stillness, just worry. And then months later, far from the life she once knew, a suitcase was found in an overgrown patch of farmland. Inside that suitcase was a body, and what remained of Rosalie Rodriguez. This is not just the story of a woman whose life was taken far too soon. This is a story of how that silence, ignored and overlooked, carried on for more than 3 years. How the man she trusted, the man she once loved, disappeared into the shadows of another identity, while the people left behind were forced to grieve in the dark. It would take over a year to even confirm her identity. It would take more than 3 years to track down the man accused of killing her. And when the case finally reached the courtroom, the outcome left many asking whether justice had truly been served. This is a story about delay, about absence, about a system that struggled to catch up. But most of all, this is a story about Rosalie Rodriguez, who she was, what was taken from her, and the long path her loved ones had to walk just to say her name out loud again, in a world that had tried to forget it. Her story deserves more than a headline. It deserves to be told in full. And tonight we tell it. Before she was anyone's headline, before her name became connected to a suitcase in a courtroom and a prison sentence, Rosalie Rodriguez was simply Rosalie. She was born in 1996, and like most young women in their 20s, she was figuring life out one day at a time. She was energetic, with an open heart. She had friends who adored her, a family that loved her deeply, and a belief, maybe even a quiet confidence, that her best years were still ahead of her. People who knew Rosalie talk about her smile first. That kind of smile that didn't need an explanation. It wasn't forced. It wasn't fake. It was the kind that made people feel like they mattered when she was around. She had that effect on people. Her presence was warm. Her laugh was genuine. And when she talked to you, she really listened. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and she was expecting a child. At just 24, Rosalie was getting ready for motherhood. For her, that meant stability. It meant the chance to create the kind of home every child deserves. A space filled with safety and calm and care. She didn't have it all figured out, but she had time. Or at least, she thought she did. Her pregnancy was a turning point. It brought a new kind of seriousness to her life. No longer just about herself. She was thinking about the future in a different way. The people around her noticed. There was a quiet shift, less impulse, more intention, more planning, more hope. But even as she prepared for this next chapter, not everyone around her was ready for that change. And not everyone wanted what was best for her. She was in a relationship at the time, a complicated one, with Juan Dominguez Garcia. To some, he was just her boyfriend. To others, there were warning signs. Unease, those quiet red flags that friends and family sometimes pick up on but can't quite name. Maybe it was the way he talked to her, or how often she seemed to apologize for things that weren't her fault. It's hard to know when a relationship begins to turn from something private to something dangerous, because on the outside, so much of it looks normal. Asterisk, Rosalie wasn't someone who asked for help easily. She didn't want to burden others, like a lot of strong women. She believed she could manage things herself, and maybe that belief, that strength, was part of what made her vulnerable in the end. When she stopped responding to messages in July of 2020, her friends knew something was wrong. This wasn't a flake out. This wasn't Rosalie. She didn't just disappear. She wasn't the type to walk away from people without a word, especially not now. Not when she was preparing to bring a child into the world. But the silence grew, and what started as worry turned into panic, then into fear, and then into something even worse, the possibility that no one was coming to help. Asterisk, we often look at true crime cases and start with the victim's last known moments. But Rosalie's life wasn't defined by how it ended. It was defined by everything that came before, by the people she loved, by the choices she made to protect her future, and by the quiet strength she carried through difficult times. That's the part we can't afford to skip past. That's the part we have to remember, because without it, her name becomes just another tragedy, another file, another woman lost in the system. And Rosalie Rodriguez was more than that. She was a life interrupted, a future stolen, a story that should have gone on much longer. When someone disappears, there's a moment, a very specific moment, when people start to realize something is wrong. At first, it's easy to explain away. Maybe their phone died. Maybe they're just busy. Maybe they needed space. But as time passes, the excuses begin to feel thin, unnatural, and then comes a moment when people stop trying to rationalize and start to fear. For those who loved Rosalie Rodriguez, that moment came quickly. In July 2020, her phone stopped ringing. Her messages went unanswered. Days passed and weeks. No check-ins, no social media posts, no sign that she was safe or even alive. For someone who was always connected, always present in the lives of her friends and family, her sudden absence was deafening. The people closest to her began reaching out, calling mutual friends, asking questions, retracing steps. It wasn't just concern, it was dread. Rosalie didn't just vanish into thin air. Something had happened. But what? And perhaps more painfully, where was the urgency? Where was the search? Where were the headlines, the press briefings, the police appeals for information? In too many cases, especially involving young women of color, disappearances are not met with swift or sustained attention. Rosalie's was no exception. It felt like she'd gone missing in the shadows, behind the scenes. Her loved ones were left to do the work themselves, to piece together timelines, to ask questions no one wanted to answer. They knew Rosalie had been in a relationship with Juan Dominguez Garcia. They knew there were tensions. They knew she hadn't seemed like herself in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. But there were no clear answers, no solid leads, just silence. And silence, in cases like this, is a cruel companion. It doesn't comfort. It doesn't explain. It lingers. And with each passing day, hope becomes harder to hold on to. But hope is stubborn. And Rosalie's family refused to let her name be forgotten. Then, in November of 2020, something unexpected happened. On a cold day in Wheaton, Wisconsin, nearly 100 miles from where Rosalie had last been seen, a group of hunters were walking across a stretch of rural farmland when they spotted something unusual in the underbrush. A large suitcase, tattered, weathered, out of place. Asterisk curious, they approached. What they found inside would mark the beginning of a horrific revelation. Human remains, folded into the suitcase, decayed, distorted by time and exposure. No ID, no clothes, no clues, at least not immediately. For weeks, the authorities worked to identify the body. There was no way to visually confirm it. They turned to forensic science, to dental records, to DNA. In April of 2021, 5 months after the discovery, the results came in asterisk. The body was Rosalie Rodriguez. For the people who've been holding their breath since the summer before, it was a confirmation they both feared and expected. The nightmare was real. Rosalie was gone. Her pregnancy, gone. Her future erased. Asterisk, and just like that, what had once been a missing persons case became something far more harrowing. Someone had put her in that suitcase. Someone had driven her body nearly 2 hours away and left in the woods. Someone had taken her life and then tried to erase the evidence. And the man who had been closest to her, the one she'd been in a relationship with at the time, was nowhere to be found. Asterisk, a suitcase in the woods. It doesn't sound like much, but to a trained eye and to a family waiting for answers, it holds the weight of everything. On November 23rd, 2020, hunters moving through a wooded area in Wheaton, Wisconsin spotted something strange. A large piece of luggage, partially hidden beneath brush and fallen leaves. It was the kind of thing that shouldn't have been there, out of place, unnerving, and far from any known road. There was no reason for it to be there, unless someone wanted it to stay hidden. Asterisk. When authorities were called to the scene, they opened the suitcase and made a grim discovery. Inside was a body, badly decomposed, folded on itself, bearing no immediate identifiers. No purse, no phone, no wallet, nothing that pointed to a name or a life. Just the brutal reality of death in a confined space. Asterisk. There are no easy answers. The cold had preserved parts of the remains, but damage from exposure, from time, and from the elements meant that facial recognition was impossible. Investigators had to rely on science, dental records, DNA, and all the while, the clock kept ticking. Months passed. Families across the region quietly wondered, could it be their missing daughter, their friend, their sister? But the silence continued. Then, in April 2021, nearly 5 months after the discovery, came the confirmation. The remains belonged to Rosalie Rodriguez, the young woman who had stopped responding to texts, the mother-to-be who had vanished without a word. Asterisk. Now, her death was no longer theory. It was fact, but how she ended up in that suitcase was still unknown. The autopsy revealed a disturbing detail. Rosalie had suffered trauma to her head. Evidence suggested she may have died from blunt force injuries. There were also signs that her body had been placed in the suitcase post-mortem and then transported to Wisconsin from Minnesota, where she had last been seen. This wasn't a panicked act. It wasn't random. It was methodical. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide her. Someone had hoped her body would never be found. But bodies don't stay hidden forever, and the lies that protect killers don't hold up forever either. Now, with a confirmed identity and a cause of death, the question turned to who, and everyone close to the investigation knew exactly where to look first. Asterisk. At the center of it all stood one man, Juan Dominguez Garcia, the man Rosalie had been dating, the man who knew she was pregnant, the man who disappeared not long after she did. Asterisk. When someone goes missing, investigators often begin with a simple question. Who was the last person to see them alive? In Rosalie Rodriguez's case, that answer was clear. Juan Dominguez Garcia. He wasn't just Rosalie's boyfriend. He was the father of her unborn child. He lived with her. He was a central figure in her day-to-day life. And when she disappeared, he did too. After July 2020, there were no public sightings, no social media updates, no signs that one was grieving, no signs that he was searching, no effort to help her family, nothing. In fact, he seemed to have vanished entirely. No job, no traceable address, no activity under his real name. But he hadn't disappeared. He was hiding in plain sight. Asterisk. In the months after Rosalie's body was discovered, investigators began connecting the dots. Friends and family told authorities that the couple had a volatile relationship. There were reports of control, jealousy, anger, quiet patterns of emotional abuse that didn't always make it into a police report, but left deep impressions on people closest to Rosalie. Asterisk. It wasn't enough to arrest him. Not yet, but it was enough to start digging. As the case developed, law enforcement learned something else. Juan Dominguez Garcia wasn't just in hiding. He had assumed a new identity. Asterisk. He was now calling himself Jose, and living in Long Prairie, Minnesota, more than 140 miles from where Rosalie had been last seen. He had taken steps to create an entirely new version of himself. New name, new relationships, a new life, and he was living it freely, working, socializing, existing within a community that had no idea who he really was, or what he was running from. It wasn't until April of 2023, more than 3 years after Rosalie disappeared, that the case finally reached a breaking point. Investigators, armed with the forensic evidence, the location of the body, the history between Rosalie and Juan, and his deliberate evasion, moved in to make an arrest. On April 14, 2023, authorities found him. He was taken into custody in Long Prairie and charged with second-degree murder, asterisk. He didn't resist. He didn't deny knowing Rosalie. But he didn't explain what happened either. The man who had once lived under the same roof as her. The man who knew she was pregnant. The man who vanished as soon as she went silent. Was now finally being held to answer. But justice, in this case, wouldn't come easily. And it wouldn't come quickly. Because the trial that followed would raise more questions than it answered. And the sentence he eventually received would leave Rosalie's family reeling. When Juan Dominguez Garcia was finally arrested in April 2023, it had been nearly 3 years since Rosalie Rodriguez's voice was last heard. 3 years since anyone had seen her alive. 3 years of questions, of silence, of grief with no closure. Now there was a name. There were charges. There was a court date. And for Rosalie's family, it meant something they hadn't had in all that time. A chance to be heard. Juan was charged with second-degree murder in Minnesota. Prosecutors laid out a story of control and violence. A story of a young woman trying to take her life in a new direction. A direction that didn't revolve around fear or instability. And a man who refused to let her go. There were no eyewitnesses to crime. No surveillance footage. No confession. But the evidence painted a haunting picture. Rosalie had been pregnant. She had suffered head trauma. Her body had been hidden inside a suitcase, then driven over 100 miles and dumped in the woods. And the man who was supposed to be closest to her had immediately changed his identity and gone into hiding. The defense didn't offer an alternative theory. They didn't argue someone else was responsible. Instead, they negotiated. In March of 2024, nearly a full year after his arrest, Juan Dominguez Garcia entered a plea. He admitted guilt, not to first-degree murder, but to second-degree murder with intent but without premeditation, asterisk. It wasn't the harshest charge he could have faced. There would be no trial, no lengthy cross-examinations, no defense witnesses, but there was sentencing. In the courtroom, Rosalie's family sat in silence as the judge read the decision. 33 years in prison. For some, it was a relief. For others, it wasn't enough. Because what is enough when you've lost a daughter? What is enough when the life of a 24-year-old woman, one who was about to become a mother, has been ended by someone she once trusted? Her family gave victim impact statements. They described the pain of not knowing, the agony of unanswered calls, the sleepless nights, the moment they learned her body had been found not in a hospital, not in a home, but in a suitcase left to decay in the woods. One relative called one a coward. Another said they hoped he'd never know peace. But the most powerful moments came not in rage, but in remembrance. Rosalie, they said, was light. Rosalie was love. Rosalie should still be here. As Juan Dominguez Garcia was led out of the courtroom, there were no apologies, no tears, no words at all, just silence. And that silence once again belonged to Rosalie's family. They had answers now, but the justice, if it could even be called that, came far too late. Long after the headlines had faded, long after the court dates and prison sentences had been filed away, the people who loved Rosalie Rodriguez continue to carry the weight of her loss. Not a statistic, not just a name in a news article, but a daughter, a friend, a young woman who deserved a chance to become a mother, to chase dreams, to grow older, and she was robbed of all of that. Rosalie's story is one of tragedy, but it is also one of resilience, of love that didn't stop after death, of a family that refused to let her be forgotten, even when the system moved slowly, even when the world wasn't paying attention. Her memory lives in every photo they've saved, every candlelit vigil they've held, every moment they speak her name out loud. She was more than the violence that ended her life. She was more than the suitcase that held her remains. She was more than the courtroom that tried to quantify her worth. She was 24 years old. She was expecting her first child. She had family. She had people who looked up to her. And even now, years after her death, she is still shaping the lives of those she left behind. When we talk about Rosalie Rodriguez, we're not just telling a crime story. We're remembering a person. And remembering matters, because silence allowed this to happen. And silence is what we must never return to. Rosalie Rodriguez should still be here. She deserved a future. She deserved safety. She deserved to be heard. If her story moved you, if it made you think about the lives we too often overlook, please take a moment to share this video. Let her name reach further than the one who took her away ever imagined. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse, please know this. Help exists. You are not alone. We've included resources in the description below. For more stories that seek not just to tell the truth, but to honor the lives behind the headlines, subscribe to this channel. We don't just cover crime. We remember the people. Thank you for watching. And thank you for remembering Rosalie Rodriguez with us. Story 4. April 16th, 2025 began like any other morning in Lexington, Kentucky. As the sun rose over the Bluegrass City, people headed out for work. School buses rolled through neighborhoods, and parents went about their routines, trusting that their children would be safe under the care of the teachers they'd come to know. Among those educators was 29-year-old Jamie Caldwell, a special education teacher at Glendover Elementary School, someone who had built a reputation for patience, commitment, and compassion inside the classroom. By all appearances, Caldwell's morning was routine as well. She left her home, got into her car, and drove toward the school where she was responsible for guiding and supporting some of the district's most vulnerable students. But her commute that morning would mark the beginning of a tragedy that would shake the community to its core. Just after 6:45 a.m., along a quiet stretch of Georgetown Road, something happened, something irreversible. A pedestrian, 32-year-old Joshua Hampton, was walking along the road. He never made it to his destination. Within moments, he was struck by a vehicle. That vehicle didn't stop. There were no flashing brake lights, no call to 911, no effort to help. The driver kept going, heading straight toward Glendover Elementary School as if nothing had happened. Later that morning, staff and students would arrive, unaware that just a few miles away, a man lay dying in the roadway, and even more unaware that the vehicle believed to have struck him was sitting quietly in the school parking lot, its damage plain to see. When police began their investigation, the answers came swiftly, but not without shock. The person they believed responsible for the hit and run wasn't a stranger passing through town. It wasn't someone with a long history of trouble with the law. According to investigators, it was Jamie Caldwell, the very teacher expected to be a role model, trusted with the lives and well-being of children every single day. What followed would uncover allegations of extreme intoxication, a blood alcohol level over 3 times the legal limit, and troubling admissions about drinking the night before and mixing alcohol with prescription medications. The details of that morning, what Jamie Caldwell saw, what she felt, what she chose to ignore, would soon be placed under a microscope. In the days that followed, a man's life was lost. A teacher's career was halted. A community began asking how something like this could happen, and how the warning signs, if any existed, could have been missed. This is the story of a quiet Kentucky neighborhood shaken by a fatal decision, and the lives forever changed in the aftermath. Jamie Caldwell wasn't a name anyone expected to hear in a criminal courtroom. Before April 16th, her life was marked not by controversy or chaos, but by a quiet and steady presence in her community. She was 29 years old, young, but experienced enough to have earned the trust of her school, her colleagues, and the family she served. As a special education teacher at Glendover Elementary in Lexington, Kentucky, Caldwell held a position that demanded empathy, discipline, and patience. The kind of role that doesn't often make headlines, but changes lives every single day. Her students were children with unique challenges, kids who needed structure, compassion, and a teacher who could meet them where they were emotionally and academically. Parents of those children didn't just send their kids to school each day. They entrusted them to someone who, in many ways, became part of their support system. For some families, she wasn't just a teacher. She was a stabilizing force, a helper, a lifeline. There were no obvious signs of trouble, no public outbursts, no history of discipline from the school district. Colleagues describe her as quiet, attentive, and committed to her work. There were no reports of absenteeism or erratic behavior in the classroom. Her online presence was minimal, and she maintained what many considered a low profile. From the outside, Jamie Caldwell was just another educator doing difficult work without expecting recognition. But life is rarely as simple as the surface suggests. According to statements made later to law enforcement, Caldwell was privately struggling. She told officers that she had been prescribed medications for anxiety, depression, and blood pressure. None of these things are inherently disqualifying. Millions of people take similar prescriptions every day. But what raises concern is what she did with that information and what she chose to ignore. On the night of April 15th, Caldwell admitted to drinking alcohol. How much he consumed isn't entirely clear. What is clear is that she made the choice to get behind the wheel the next morning after mixing alcohol with prescription drugs known to impair judgment and coordination. She later told police she didn't feel intoxicated, but blood alcohol concentration of 0.278 tells a very different story. That level is more than 3 times Kentucky's legal limit and consistent with severe impairment. Not the kind of impairment that goes unnoticed, but the kind that often results in slurred speech, blurry vision, delayed reactions, and impaired motor function. And yet, she drove. April 16th was a Wednesday, a regular school day. The kind of morning where teachers across Lexington would have been going through the motions of their routine, coffee, lesson plans, student check-ins. But for Jamie Caldwell, that morning would mark a crossing of a line that couldn't be undone. Her commute took her down Georgetown Road, a well-traveled route through the city. Traffic was moving, pedestrians were out, and among them was 32-year-old Joshua Hampton. Joshua was walking, just trying to get to where he needed to be. He had no idea that the car coming down the road toward him was being operated by someone who, according to police, had no business being behind the wheel. There's no evidence of braking, no swerve to avoid impact. Just a collision, violent, sudden, and final. A man was hit, a life was shattered, and the driver kept going. According to the official statement, Jamie Caldwell didn't stop to check on him. She didn't call for help. Instead, she drove to Glendover Elementary, parked her damaged car in the lot, and went inside. To work, to teach, to begin a day that, for everyone else at the school, appeared no different from the one before. But it was different. Joshua Hampton was lying in the road, fatally injured. Witnesses were calling 911. First responders were arriving at the scene. And somewhere in the midst of it all, a teacher was trying to carry on as if nothing had happened. When police began canvassing the area and examining surveillance footage, they identified the vehicle involved, and it led them directly to the school. They found the car, they found the damage, and inside they found Jamie Caldwell. What came next would not only launch a criminal case, but spark a wave of questions that still have no easy answers. How could someone go to work after something like that? Was this a one-time decision, or a sign of something deeper? Could this have been prevented? And if so, how? The answers, if they exist at all, are buried in choices made long before that morning. Choices to drink, choices to medicate, choices to drive, and most critically, the choice not to stop. When the 911 calls started coming in that morning, Lexington police responded quickly. A pedestrian had been hit on Georgetown Road. The vehicle that struck him was gone. The scene was chaotic. Fragmented glass, the impact point on the pavement, a shoe left behind. First responders tried everything they could, but it was too late. Joshua Hampton was pronounced dead shortly after the impact. He was 32 years old. The investigation began immediately. Officers started speaking with witnesses, pulling surveillance footage from nearby buildings, and looking for any vehicle that matched the description given by people who had seen the crash. The driver hadn't stopped, but the vehicle had been seen, a dark-colored Hyundai Elantra, speeding away without hesitation. By 9 a.m., police had traced the car to a parking lot less than 15 minutes away, the staff lot at Glendover Elementary School. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't even parked unusually. It sat in its normal place, surrounded by other vehicles belonging to teachers and administrators. But unlike the others, this one had visible front-end damage, a shattered windshield, a dented hood, and pieces of trim missing. When officers entered the building and requested to speak with the owner of the car, they were directed to Jamie Caldwell. What they encountered in the main office wasn't a scene of confusion or panic. Caldwell wasn't trying to flee. She wasn't in tears. According to the report, she seemed disoriented, dazed. Perhaps her eyes were glassy, her movement slow. When questioned, she didn't deny driving the car that morning. But what she said next raised red flags that couldn't be ignored. Caldwell told police she had taken her prescribed medications that morning, medications for anxiety and blood pressure. She also admitted she had been drinking the night before. When they asked her if she realized she had hit someone, she answered no. She said she thought she had hit a trash can. That's what she told herself when she heard the sound, the sudden thud, but didn't stop to check. Officers noticed a strong odor of alcohol on her breath. They conducted a field sobriety test, which she failed. A portable breathalyzer was then administered. The number that appeared shocked even the officers, 0.278. At that level, the average person would be heavily impaired, unable to drive safely, unable to process information clearly. It's not a level you reach after a single drink. It's not something that fades after a few hours of sleep. This was an indicator that Caldwell had either continued drinking through the early hours of the morning or had consumed a quantity of alcohol far beyond what would be considered moderate. And now, with prescription drugs added to the mix, she was in no condition to be behind the wheel, let alone responsible for a classroom full of children. She was arrested on the spot and charged with operating a motor vehicle under the influence, leaving the scene of a fatal collision and failure to render aid. As she was let out of the school in handcuffs, staff looked on in disbelief. A teacher they had worked with for years, someone who had shown up that morning, just like them, prepared for a normal school day. News of the arrest spread quickly. Local media began covering the incident as more details emerged. Lexington residents watched in disbelief as the story developed. A respected educator now accused of driving drunk, killing a man, and walking into her school as if nothing had happened. For the family of Joshua Hampton, the grief was immediate. His mother, his loved ones, and his friends struggled to understand how someone could hit a person and keep driving, how a life could be taken in an instant, and how the person responsible could report to work without ever calling for help. In the following days, the Fayette County Public Schools District confirmed that Caldwell had been placed on administrative leave. A substitute was brought in to take over her classroom. The students, many of them unaware of the events that had unfolded, were told only that their teacher will be gone for a while. But for the adults in that building and for parents across the city, the damage had already been done. Jamie Caldwell was booked into the Fayette County Detention Center. Her bond was set at $25,000. On May 1st, she appeared in court and pleaded not guilty to all charges. The judge ordered her released under home incarceration pending further proceedings. She would wait for her next hearing not in a jail cell, but in her own home, her car impounded, her teaching job suspended, and her name now tied to the death of a man who should still be alive. The investigation is ongoing. Prosecutors are reviewing the evidence. Toxicology reports, traffic camera footage, witness statements, all will play a role in what comes next. But the question remains, what does justice look like in a case like this? Can a courtroom truly measure the cost of a life lost and a community shaken? His name was Joshua Hampton. He was 32 years old, not famous, not wealthy, not someone whose name regularly appeared in headlines or whose story had been broadcast across the country, until his life was taken without warning and without mercy on a quiet Kentucky road. Joshua was more than the word pedestrian printed in the police report. He was a son, a brother, a man with his own struggles, his own story, and people who cared deeply for him. The morning of April 16th was a symbolic day or a turning point in his life. It was just another day. One more morning to move through, one more destination to reach, until it became the last. In the aftermath of his death, his mother stepped forward to speak for him. Her words were raw, honest, filled with the kind of pain that can't be written away or eased by the legal process. She talked about her son, who he was, what he meant to her, how he had battled challenges and kept moving forward. She said she forgave Jamie Caldwell. But forgiveness doesn't erase grief. It doesn't bring back the person who never came home. Joshua's family was left to mourn a man who didn't get the chance to fight for his life, who wasn't given even a moment of aid or compassion from the person whose car hit him. That absence, that decision to keep driving, is what haunts those left behind. For the community, the tragedy came with a sense of shock, followed quickly by discomfort. There was the obvious pain, the loss of a human being, the unimaginable suffering of a grieving family. But there was also something else, a question many found themselves struggling with. How could a teacher, someone so many trusted, someone inside a school building surrounded by children, make a decision that ended in death? Parents began asking if there were signs, warning behaviors, red flags missed by the school or colleagues. Could this tragedy have been prevented if someone had spoken up earlier? Or was this truly a moment of terrible judgment that no one could have seen coming? Teachers quietly asked themselves if they had missed something. Administrators re-examined safety protocols. And students, they may not have known the full extent of what happened, but they sensed a shift, the absence of their teacher, the way adults whispered in the hallways, the way their parents looked at the school with new eyes. For those who knew Joshua personally, the grief was personal and immediate. For the rest of Lexington, it was a reminder that tragedy doesn't always wear a mask, that sometimes the most devastating decisions are made in ordinary houses, by people who appear to have it all together, and that in a single moment, lives will be unraveled, not just by violence, but by recklessness. Candlelight vigils were held. People gathered not only to remember Joshua, but to process the enormity of what had occurred. A man had lost his life. A woman had lost her freedom. And a community was left asking itself where the line had been crossed and whether it could happen again. Joshua Hampton will never have the chance to speak for himself in court. He will never be able to tell the world who he was or what he was walking toward that morning. His voice was taken the moment he was struck. But through his family, through the grief they carry and the stories they tell, his memory remains. And his life, however ordinary it may have seemed to the outside world, continues to echo through every courtroom appearance, every news report, every conversation about accountability and trust. In this story, there are no winners, only broken lives, one ended, one derailed, and many more left to pick up the pieces. In the eyes of the law, Jamie Caldwell now faces a future defined not by classrooms or lesson plans, but by criminal charges, court appearances, and the possibility of prison. Her plea? Not guilty. A decision that, legally speaking, preserves her rights and forces the prosecution to prove its case. But for many, especially those grieving the death of Joshua Hampton, that plea was difficult to hear. The list of charges against her is serious. Driving under the influence, leaving the scene of a fatal accident, failure to render aid, and possibly more, depending on the outcome of ongoing toxicology reports and investigative findings. Each charge carries weight, not just in sentencing guidelines, but in the message it sends. That choices have consequences. That the value of a human life doesn't disappear because the person responsible wears the title of teacher. Under Kentucky law, leaving the scene of an accident that results in death is a felony, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. The DUI charge, given her high blood alcohol level, could bring additional jail time, especially when tied to fatality. And failure to render aid, that's more than a legal term. That's the human element, the decision not to stop, not to call 911, not to kneel beside the man whose life had just changed forever. That single choice, whether from fear, confusion, or deliberate avoidance, has become the most haunting detail of the entire case. Her attorney argues that Caldwell never intended harm, that she didn't know she had hit a person, that her medications and alcohol clouded her perception to the point of disconnection from reality. And while the legal system must consider intent, impairment, and mental state, it must also confront the result. A man is dead, a family is mourning, and the public is watching. The judge released her on home incarceration. No jail cell, no prison transport. Instead, Jamie Caldwell now sits in her home, monitored, awaiting the next steps in a case that could take months or longer to resolve. The decision drew mixed reactions. Some viewed it as a fair and standard move for someone with no prior criminal history. Others saw it as a privilege, a grace that wouldn't have been extended to someone without her background, her job title, or her connections. In the court of public opinion, the debate rages on. Social media lit up with comments, opinions, arguments. Some expressed sympathy, pointing to mental health, substance use, the pressures of modern life. Others were furious. They saw the death of Joshua Hampton not as an accident, but as a result of a string of conscious, reckless decisions to drink, to drive, to walk away. And for parents in Lexington, the story struck a particularly painful nerve. This wasn't just about a teacher. It was about trust. The belief that the people who care for children are stable, safe, and sober, that they can be counted on not just in the classroom, but in the world, that they won't, under any circumstance, drive to work under the influence and kill someone along the way. The prosecution has made clear it will pursue this case seriously. Surveillance footage, dashcam video, breathalyzer results, toxicology reports, all will be entered into evidence. The defense, meanwhile, may seek to argue diminished capacity, intent, or even a plea agreement, depending on how the case progresses. But no matter what legal route is taken, the fundamental truth remains unchanged. A man is gone. A community is shaken. And a teacher once trusted and admired now stands at the center of a case that questions how far one person can fall and what justice really means when the damage is already done. In every city, in every town, there are people we trust by default. Teachers, nurses, coaches, clergy, the kinds of people we hand our children over to each day, believing that their roles require not just skill, but character. And most of the time, they earn that trust. Most of the time, they carry the weight of that responsibility with care. But then comes a moment, one that doesn't fit the script, one that doesn't make sense. A teacher, a respected adult, wakes up, gets in her car, drives to school, and along the way hits a man and keeps going. That's not just a violation of the law. That's a rupture in the quiet agreement that holds our communities together. We ask ourselves, how does someone make that decision? How many small choices came before it? And how do we measure accountability for something that can't be undone? Jamie Caldwell's case will work its way through the courts. There will be motions filed, hearings scheduled, deals offered or rejected. Lawyers will argue. Judges will decide. But beyond the legal process is something deeper, something harder to face. The understanding that good jobs and good reputations don't prevent bad decisions. That even those we trust most can cause irreversible harm. And that one night of drinking, one morning of denial, one failure to stop can destroy more than one life. For the family of Joshua Hampton, justice will never mean restoration. It will never bring back the man they loved. And for the parents whose children sat in Jamie Caldwell's classroom, justice won't erase the questions now echoing in their minds. Was this really her first time driving under the influence? Could this have been prevented? What if the crash had happened a few blocks later, near the school? These are the hard questions. The ones that don't make headlines but live quietly in the hearts of those left behind. In the end, this story is not just about a fatal accident. It's about the cost of neglecting that final moment of responsibility, the choice to turn the key in the ignition, the decision to keep moving after hearing that sound, the silence that followed. It is a reminder that trust is fragile, and that once broken, it can't simply be put back together with court dates or statements. What happened on that April morning can't be undone. And no matter the outcome of the trial, the echoes of that day will remain on Georgetown Road, in a quiet elementary school, in a grieving family's home, and in the memory of a man whose life ended not in a storm of violence, but in the quiet, careless moment when someone decided to keep driving,